Hey all, Alex here at your home with a music deep dive. And today it's time for part 8 of the record collection tour that I've been going over with you guys for the past, what is it, 2 months now? 8 weeks is about 2 months, that's correct math. Um, so let's hop right on into it. Only one more record left in the seas, and I know it's always fun to start with a record that I have in my collection but I've never heard before. Um, Although I feel like I've heard half of these songs before because of 80s radio and stuff like that. Culture Club, Color by Numbers from 83. Um, I love Karma Chameleon. I think that is a super fun pop song. And I like Boy George's stage presence just in general. I think Culture Club I feel like they weren't a band that were destined to be very big for very long. They're very much a product of their time. But um for being so much a product of their time, I think the songwriting of their hits holds up pretty well. But no, I have not heard this whole album from start to finish, so I will not comment on it. Again, I got this as part of another collection. But I believe it is their most acclaimed album pretty significantly, so um, I'm sure I'll enjoy it when I eventually get around to hearing it. But now let's change gears completely and talk about jazz for a little bit. Miles Davis. I have three Miles Davis albums on vinyl. Um, the first one is it's one of my favorites. All three of these are among my favorites of his, but this one is probably top five for me, and one that I think needs to be in the conversation for um, among his best records more often. And it's the French soundtrack Ascenseur pour l'échafaud. Um, l'échafaud. Um, English being lift to the scaffold from 58. And I adore the atmosphere of this record. So there was a point in time when I was trying to listen to Miles' discography chronologically, and I made it most of the way through. Um, it was in conjunction with another project that I ended up abandoning, but I did make it through a lot of his 50s and 60s albums. But God, the atmosphere of this record, the really just smoky atmosphere of this whole album is second to none. I've never seen the film. I can't comment on it. Um, but I think both the kind of first side with the shorter kind of instrumental cues and the second side, which is more kind of typical of what Davis was doing with, on Green Dolphin Street, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I think is just I think both aspects of this record are phenomenal, and I think it deserves. It's not that it doesn't receive acclaim, but I think as far as Davis creating a unique atmosphere in his sessions, in his recordings, deserves a bit more acclaim than I think what it has been getting. Kind of Blue. Um, I talked about this a little bit in my last video when I was discussing A Love Supreme. This is a 180 gram reissue. I believe this is on blue vinyl, which is really cool. But one of those albums, I think this was the first dedicated jazz album that I listened to, apart from like Vince Guaraldi's Charlie Brown Christmas, which we will also get to, not in this video, but in the future. And I think the impact was immediate, not in the sense that I understood it, because I didn't understand shit until I really kind of burrowed myself deep into 50s jazz for an extended period of time. But just because the melodies are so accessible, The playing is it's fantastic, but it's sort of subdued in a way to where they're not freestyle soloing in a way that would turn off your average audience. You know, this is music that your average person can appreciate just as pleasing sound, even if they don't understand kind of the nuances of what is being done. Um, and I still won't claim I understand the nuances, but I can at least understand more and more how this was substantially different from jazz records that came before, just from a sonic perspective. Um, Phenomenal lineup, one of the best jazz lineups you'll ever see, with Miles, Cannonball Adderley, Coltrane, Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, and Jimmy Cobb. I mean, Jesus. I mean, phenomenal, phenomenal, phenomenal lineup. And one of those albums where you sort of run out of interesting things to say because it is the most covered jazz album ever, from a journalistic and analytical standpoint. But it's terrific. And on a side note, I did read Miles' autobiography at one point, and that is a trip. That is something that I recommend any jazz listener read, any jazz fan. He was a unique character in his life, a mercurial personality, and that really comes out in the writing of that book, and a lot of really fascinating stories. It's one of my favorite music autobiographies that I've read. Bitches Brew is the other Miles album that I have on vinyl. The one I'm trying to target is In a Silent Way. I haven't found it, or I just haven't laid down the money to actually get it. But In a Silent Way is possibly my favorite Miles album. But Bitches Brew is very close. I think this is a super... it's unwieldy in its length, for sure. It's incredibly ambitious. But it sticks the landing. And I think that's because Miles has a very... People compare Miles Davis to Prince in a way, just because of kind of his artistic vision. And the two of them, of course, even collaborated together on some level and had a very strong mutual respect. But one of the things that makes a lot of Prince albums work, even the ones that are less interesting in the stereotypical sense, is that really focused artistic vision. I mean, he is so, not only is his songcraft and his musicianship so high to the point where it's almost unequaled, but he has a clear sense of vision. And he's able to focus even his most diverse projects. And with Miles, I think it's a lot of the same thing. Granted, I haven't heard his late 70s and 80s stuff. I hear it does get a lot worse there, but Bitches Brew works because of Miles' artistic focus, also because of the musicians on there, which is another phenomenal lineup. But yeah, it's terrific. Terrific, terrific. And don't ask me to rank these albums. Again, In a Silent Way, I think, is my favorite Miles Davis album, but it's hard. There's a lot of competition near the top. John Denver making a couple of appearances here. Poems, Prayers, and Promises from 71. This has two of his most famous songs on it in Take Me Home, Country Roads, and Sunshine on My Shoulders. But there's a lot of other great stuff on here. This is, I think, a very strong front-to-back album, for the most part. Couple of Beatles or Beatles-adjacent covers. There's a cover of Let It Be on here, and also a cover of Paul McCartney's Junk, James Taylor's Fire and Rain. John Denver, kind of like what I was talking about with Judy Collins in the last video, John Denver is someone who I think could benefit from critical reappraisal. I think that is a singer-songwriter who... again, he's an interpreter of songs, not as much a songwriter on his own merit, compared to like a Joni Mitchell or someone like that. But boy, he sells what he sings. He sells what he sings. Super underrated singer, too. Like a phenomenal and powerful voice when he wanted to utilize it. So And if you read his story, also a really tragic story. So I think John Denver is another one who could benefit from critical reappraisal. Um, I've heard maybe like 5, 6 albums of his. Here's a greatest hits album, unrelated. I think my mom has this on CD or something very similar. So it includes a lot of his most famous stuff. Again, Take Me Home, Country Roads, and Sunshine on My Shoulders are both here. Leaving on a Jet Plane, Rocky Mountain High. This came out in '73, though, so this doesn't include some of the later stuff, like Calypso and Thank God I'm a Country Boy. Songs like that, Annie's Song. But it's a good compilation. And speaking of, here's Wind Song, which is probably his most famous of the mid to late 70s album, 75. Calypso's on here, which is a great song. Also on here, Looking for Space, which may be my favorite John Denver song and my favorite John Denver vocal performance. I think he sells that. He, in those choruses, absolutely belts them out. Yeah, no. I love John Denver's voice. Again, I don't know how great his absolute best albums are. I do think Poems, Prayers, and Promises is probably his best, but does it rank among the best albums of the period? No. But I think Denver as a performer and as an interpreter of songs is terrific and underrated in the modern era. Bo Diddley. Man, I love this album. Bo Diddley, I think he's one of my favorite of the early rock and roll artists, and might be my favorite aside from Little Richard, who I think Little Richard is pretty much unequaled as a performer in that era. But Bo Diddley, his style of performing and the just the approach of these songs that he writes, they're not that same kind of fireball mania that you get in a Little Richard or a Jerry Lee Lewis type of thing. He's very laid back. He's very cool, Bo Diddley is. But he also knows how to wield a groove, as evidenced by the title song. Like these songs jam. They're really groovy, and they're also just a hell of a lot of fun. So yeah, this is the original. It's a different cover photo, but it is the debut album, which contains. I think it's mostly a collection of singles that he had already released, but great stuff on here. And I've liked pretty much every Bo Diddley album that I've heard, which is about 6 or 7, but I don't think he quite touched the energy of that debut. The originality of that sound. All right, Dire Straits coming up here. Here's the debut. Dire Straits, I really like them. I've never had a point where I've fallen in love with an album to the point where I think, oh, this is like a 10 out of 10 type of thing. But they've always been a part of my life. My dad's been not a big fan of Dire Straits, more so he's always been a major fan of Sultans of Swing and Money for Nothing, and the guitar playing in both of those songs specifically. So obviously this debut has Sultans of Swing. And yeah, I mean, what can you say? I think it is a guitar opus that is also not full of itself. It doesn't have the sort of dramatic gravitas of like a Comfortably Numb or something like that. It is very reserved, I guess. I mean, it is kind of a reserved song, even though it does have it's still a beat, it still has a groove, but Knopfler isn't sort of putting a spotlight on himself so much as he's just like, all right, I'm just going to bust out this solo, and if y'all want to pay attention, you can. And of course we do, because he's a phenomenal player and one of the cleanest electric guitar players out there, in my book. Making movies. So I don't have a couple of Dire Straits albums. I don't have Most of these I actually got. Actually, that's not true. I think it was just this one and the next one. I got these in as part of a larger collection, and I remember when I went through the Dire Straits albums first, and Making Movies was my least favorite. This was a while ago now, though. Um, I seem to remember it started strong with Tunnel of Love and Romeo and Juliet, and then kind of petered out. But it has been a while since I've heard this record, so I do not want to besmirch it or anything. And I didn't dislike any Dire Straits album. I thought they were all, at the very least, pretty good. This was my favorite upon first listen, Love Over Gold, which I love that album cover. I love that album cover. But this one, I think, won me over because of the mood of it. It is a very kind of lush, quiet, not really dark album, but there is a moodiness of sorts, I suppose, and a muted characteristic to everything. Telegraph Road, phenomenal song, and one of the great. I think Telegraph Road is one of the great. It's. I don't know if I would call it the greatest Dire Straits song, although there's certainly an argument to be made there. But it really, to me, it stands out as one of the best over 10-minute songs potentially ever made. Frankly, I'm not someone who has a ton of patience for super long songs, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And you may see this come up in some of the other records that I talk about. But Telegraph Road, I don't know. That one appeals to me. I don't get tired of it. I think that one stands out. The other thing too, that album has more maybe more obvious of a Springsteen influence, which, and I'm not a Springsteen super fan by any means, but I think I do appreciate that kind of characteristic. I think that speaks to the songwriting maturing a little bit. Brothers in Arms. I feel like if I were to reevaluate now, this would probably be my favorite Dire Straits album. I think it's very sharp. Sharper songwriting while still maintaining a lot of the same characteristics that I really like in Love Over Gold. Great singles across the board. Again, Money for Nothing is great, but I do love the title track. I love the title track, and I love the kind of expressionist ideas, I guess, that he's kind of talking about. Anti-war songs are nothing new. I'm not really saying that what he's speaking to is super unique, but I do like the atmosphere. I do like the kind of dark and suspenseful atmosphere that he's providing. So, moving on to a band of similar era, but a very different band. The Doobie Brothers. This is Best of the Doobies, Volume 1, which contains a lot of the best songs from the early years, from their first 6 albums, it looks like. So a lot of the Tom Johnston stuff is included on here. The stuff featuring Tom Johnston, I should say. So like China Grove, Long Train Runnin', Listen to the Music, stuff like that is included on here. You do have a little bit of Michael McDonald because he had come into the fold at that point. But for the most part, this is the early years. I got this, again, this was another one of the first records I got. I wanted to get a compilation rather than listening to all of the individual Doobies albums, which I've only heard a couple front to back, including this one, Minute by Minute, from 78, I believe. Yes. Minute by Minute is, to me, this is the peak Michael McDonald album. Not because it's the most obviously Michael McDonald record. I think there are other ones where he is maybe even more present, but I think he fits into the band super smoothly here, and this is also where he's incorporating his own kind of smoother influences, the type of stuff, you know, he was picking up from Steely Dan or whatever. He's incorporating that sound into the songwriting, and I think it works the best here. What a Fool Believes is one of the great pop songs ever, in my personal opinion. I think it is, there's so much going on. It's so unorthodox in its construction that people don't give it credit. Like, it's a, you know, people think of it as a bop. And they know Michael McDonald's a great singer. But I don't think people realize how sophisticated the construction is of that song and like the chord progressions that he's doing. Also the fact that he's throwing out all these different melodic ideas, whether it's in the verses and the pre-choruses and the chorus themselves, and also how ridiculous McDonald's vocal is. I mean, you know, people, when you read articles about it, you think like, oh, you know, McDonald is, you know, uses his falsetto all the time. And that's not falsetto he's doing, folks. He's doing this like kind of head voice, chest voice thing, which is way fucking harder, requires a lot of really good technique. And that's why he's able to get power in it, rather than just kind of the airiness that you'll get from falsetto. It's a phenomenal vocal. It's a phenomenal performance. And I don't know if I would say McDonald never equaled it, but boy, it certainly stands apart from everything else on the record by a huge margin. And then Best of the Doobies Volume 2, which I got at the same time as I did Volume 1. A lot of the, again, it's from, you know, the remaining albums with McDonald. So arguably a weaker compilation, depending on who you ask. I do think that after Minute by Minute, the other McDonald albums are not quite as good from what I've heard. But still, really interesting band. Kind of an underappreciated band as well. All right. Got some interesting ones now. Donovan, Mellow Yellow. This is the only Donovan record that I have. You know, I've heard a bunch of his albums, but again, it was a long time ago. Like, this is probably about 6 years ago now that I heard his stuff. So I want to explore it, especially because I recently got into the song Sand and Foam off of this album. I had heard it mentioned on a podcast that was talking about, I think it was like the Beatles in Rishikesh, and discussing, you know, pretty famously Donovan teaching this finger picking technique to John Lennon, and Lennon used that on a couple of his songs like Dear Prudence and Julia. And they use Sand and Foam. They play Sand and Foam in the podcast as an example of the same technique, which I think it kind of is, at least. But it's so funny because when you listen to that song, you hear how incredible of a guitarist he is. And this is something, we're going to talk about this in my next album too. As much as I love electric guitars and electric guitar solos, I adore this type of stuff. When you have someone with an acoustic guitar who is so proficient, who is so good that he or she can like make it sound as though there's multiple guitars playing at the same time, can just fill the entire space consistently. That is the type of stuff that kind of boggles my mind, like really great finger picking. And Sand and Foam is a perfect example of that. I think that is an amazing, amazing, amazing song. So Donovan, another artist, very hopefully soon to be revisited by me, because I do want to check his 60s stuff out again and maybe explore his 70s stuff too, to kind of see what he has to offer. But now we get into an album that is perhaps top 5 for me of all time, probably top 10. Nick Drake's Pink Moon. Now I did a video, not on my channel. I submitted kind of a collaborative video for this other YouTube channel, Tastes Like Music. They were doing kind of a Discord community top 10 video for the best albums of 1972. And I was the one who ended up speaking on Pink Moon, which I think came at number 3 on the community list or something like that. So you can go to that video if you want my maybe more articulate, more prepared thoughts on the record. But what I will say is it is commonly referred to as a very dark and depressing album because Nick Drake would obviously take his own life a couple of years later. And this was the last album he released before that period. But I think there actually is a lot of kind of light and life and themes of renewal in this album. The acoustic guitar playing on this, I think, might be my favorite out of any album ever made, or any album that I've ever heard, at least. The only things that could compare would maybe be like John Fahey records or something, which I don't believe I have any on vinyl, sadly. But in any case, the songs are really beautiful. The guitar playing alone makes this transcendent. And Drake's kind of broken vocals, really soft-spoken, forlorn vocal delivery, I think, also sells it. But again, people, I think, read too much into the vocal delivery. Like, he sounds sad. And it's like, well, no, you listen to the lyrics, and I don't think that entirely tells the whole story. So, yeah, what can you say? I only have one Bob Dylan album on vinyl, and I actually got this just the weekend before I'm recording this, which is kind of funny. Blood on the Tracks from 75. Picking a favorite Bob Dylan album is really tough because I think he has 4 or 5. I think he might have 5 that are all in really similar territory for me. But I tend to go with this one if I'm just kind of thinking in terms of the qualities of the songs and things like that. I think there's a real strong sense of kind of renewal. Obviously, he had been in a bit of a rut. Not as much of a rut, I think, as people want to claim. I don't think his early 70s albums are bad at all. But, he's not, he's not making the same quote-unquote inspired material that he was back in the 60s. So people are sad about that. And then Planet Waves comes back, and I think Planet Waves is kind of a comeback in and of itself, but Blood on the Tracks comes off and just, knocks people's socks off, and they're like, Dylan's back. And I'm also partial to it because so much of it was recorded in Minnesota. So, bully for us. But, yeah, it's I think a lot of his best lyrics come off of this album, Tangled Up in Blue and Idiot Wind especially. But Dylan is someone who I do plan to get complete on at some point. It's not easy. There's a lot of records, but again, especially in Minnesota, even though, Dylan has supposedly, I don't think Dylan has a lot of love lost for Minnesota, and doesn't exactly make a point of going back here. We still have a lot of Dylan shit because we're proud of him because he's one of us, as we like to say. So, his records are very, very easy to find. I just have not made a particularly focused attempt on buying them. But now that the die has been cast, I suppose there will be more to come. So look out for those in future videos. But on to the Eagles. I'm not complete on the Eagles, as you can see, because my first one I'm showing is their third album, On the Border. Which is a pretty strong album. Kind of a strange one, in the sense that it's one of the Eagles records, one of the only ones where I don't think the singles are necessarily the best things about the album. Or at least they don't stand that much more above everything else. Because I think that's the problem with the Eagles. All their albums are very top heavy. This one doesn't suffer from that quite as much. And I get a kick out of the fact that they covered Tom Waits. I mean, I know Old 55 is like the Eagles version is more widely known than the Tom Waits version at this point, most likely. So, it's not a surprising thing because that's a 50-year-old cover, but still, the idea that they would cover Tom Waits, one of the most celebrated kind of, serious artists or whatever, being covered by a band that a lot of people who love serious artists absolutely despise, is never going to be not hilarious to me. One of These Nights, which actually might be my favorite Eagles album. I'm pretty sure, this cover's like Water Damaged or something. Not very strong, so I might look for an alternate at some point. The singles on this are the best, I think, out of any of their albums. The title track, Lion Eyes, and Take It to the Limit are fantastic songs, I think. And I think it also has the least amount of like obvious songs that annoy me, I guess. I don't know how to describe it. I think this one and Hotel California are very close together for my favorites, but I tend to lean this one because again, if you just focusing on the singles, because they are the most memorable parts of these albums. The title track, I think, has a great groove to it. Lion Eyes might be Glenn Frey's finest moment. It's either that or, Take It Easy, probably, but... And then Take It to the Limit is this random Randy Meisner feature, which, he doesn't get featured on, like, the popular songs very frequently, but he sells this one. A phenomenal vocal. Which is funny because, if I'm remembering what I'm reading correctly, isn't one of the reasons he left the Eagles because he wanted to sing that song in a lower key and they weren't happy about it or something. Which is like, sorry, it's a hard fucking song to sing. He's going up to like B flat or something like that. But I digress. Great, very, very, very good album. Probably a great one. Eagles' Greatest Hits. I got this one as part of a collection as well before I got any of the individual studio albums. It has a bunch of songs that you hear on the radio all the time. If you listen to classic rock radio, a lot of strong, and they're all good, I think. I don't despise Glenn Frey's songs as much as some people do. Some people think he's extremely annoying, but I tend to like the atmosphere of them for the most part. And Witchy Woman, I think, is actually a really cool. I know that's not, that one wasn't written by them, I don't believe, but I really love the atmosphere of that song. So that's a highlight. Here's Hotel California. Very highly acclaimed, and I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the addition of Joe Walsh being pretty major, pretty huge for them. I think his guitar sound works well, even though I think it also clashes a little bit at times. He is a lot more aggressive of a guitar player than what I think they were used to with Don Felder and the like. But I think he certainly inspires them a lot for this album. And then I think on the next one, The Long Run, is where you start to notice like the fractures really becoming obvious. But Hotel California was a song I was incredibly sick of for a long time because of its exposure on classic rock radio. But once I stopped listening to the radio for an extended period of time, eventually it grew on me more. And so now I feel like I can appreciate it properly on its own merits without it being kind of altered for me. Speaking of The Long Run, I got it because it was cheap, but this, I think, is very obviously the weakest of the 70s albums. It is kind of the, like, it's a very obvious, like, pre-breakup album. Like, they are on the fritz. They're not really interacting as a band. Everyone's kind of sequestered into doing their own thing, and that makes it all sound very segmented, very inconsistent. There's no album flow to speak of, I think, on this album. But there are decent songs on here. I like the Joe Walsh one, In the City, a decent bit. Those shoes, the talk box thing that they're doing, The main reason why I like that song is because when I actually saw the Eagles live, in 2018 or 2019, one of those years, um, that song I think actually worked really well live, with Walsh doing the talk box. I thought it was really cool. Um, and I like the Timothy B. Schmidt. I can't tell you why. I really like that song too. But again, very uneven album. And from a band that has been pretty consistent about putting out consistent records. Top heavy, maybe, but again, ones with where there was still some sense of cohesion, at least, even with the weaker songs. I think that makes the long run stand out like a sore thumb. And so, probably my bottom Eagles album, though I have not heard Long Road Out of Eden. I would expect that would be the worst. Two more to go. This one is interesting. Um, a band that most people have not heard of, I'm sure. Um, Early Eyes, Look Alive. A record that I've not heard either, but there's a reason I got it. Number one, because again, I like taking chances on these things, but number two is because I have a personal connection to Early Eyes. They are a Minneapolis based indie pop outfit, that formed on the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus in late 2016. They became pretty popular locally, and they're still extremely popular locally, although they've gone through many lineup changes. And they've actually done some kind of widespread tours and stuff like that. They're signed to a major label, Epitaph, and they've kind of, I'm not going to go out here and say they're one of the absolute most successful acts to come out of Minneapolis in the last decade. I think that's an exaggeration. That may be an exaggeration anyways, but they've done extremely well. And the interesting part is that the band, like I said, founded on the U of M Twin Cities campus, they were actually formed in the residence hall that I lived in while I was living in it. They actually formed literally just a floor below me. I was acquainted with a couple of their band members. I mean, we were in like the same like orientation group during like orientation week for incoming freshmen. So I was acquainted with them. I knew them. We would talk sometimes. And I'm still in touch with one of the original members today. We still talk occasionally. So it's really interesting, it's kind of cool because you could feel, just talking about my experience, you could feel the hype for this band building. You could see it like in the dining halls, like they would be there and they'd have this whole clique of people kind of surrounding them. And you'd hear them talking about the shows, and you'd see people posting on Facebook about the shows, and just all this hype that was like building on the campus. And they were like among the biggest things. And it was so interesting and fascinating to watch. And now they are where they are. And who knows where they're going to be going forward, Again, I feel like they sort of rose really quickly. And then they've kind of just been steadily rising after that. As far as what I personally think of the music, I think it's nice indie pop. Again, I can't speak to Look Alive, but their earlier stuff was pretty fun jangle pop. Little bit of like, I know they were influenced by Mac DeMarco pretty heavily, although it's like way more upbeat than DeMarco's stuff. It's not like kind of slacker bedroom pop. It really is more like jangle pop type of stuff. And I don't think they've changed their sound all that much, but again, they have players coming in and out, getting in more ideas. So it's interesting. And I think it's just really cool to kind of have that on vinyl as kind of proof of this little bit of a small bit of musical history that I was a very, very proximate firsthand witness to. Last record I have is Billie Eilish, When We All Fall Asleep. Where Do We Go? Target edition, so glow in the dark LP, I suppose. Yeah, this is one of, I have a lot of thoughts about Billie Eilish, just in general as a cultural figure. But I think ultimately, just to kind of boil it all down, I think that she and her brother Phineas, especially with this record, put together one of the most compelling bits of pop music that we've seen in a while. Um, you know, they're synthesizing influences. I don't necessarily like, I wouldn't say they found a new sound, quote unquote, but the approach that she's taking with her vocal style, okay, that's not entirely new. We've seen it done with Lord and people like that. That very husky, whispery sound. But combining that with Phineas's productions, which are very like abrasive at times, um, I think that pairing is something that um, people weren't expecting, I suppose. Like it I think that pairing clashes a lot with the stuff like if we're using Lord as an example, what she did on like Melodrama, where it is these kind of husky vocals but mixed with this very lush production. And there's not as much of this here. It is pretty, it's all over the place, but there are moments like, I mean, Bad Guy and You Should See Me in a Crown, which are just very dark. Again, abrasive production at times. Um, and the way they like edit her vocals and distort them and pitch shift them sometimes. Um, just really, they do so many interesting things with her. And I think she's a compelling stage presence as well. Um, and a compelling songwriter, at least if, if it's true that she's writing a decent chunk of these songs along with Phineas, which I believe she does. Um, she's a very, very interesting figure. Side one of this album, I don't think side two is quite as strong, but the first side is like remarkable. It is banger after banger. Um, really, really great stuff. And almost all of them, I think, were like major charting hits. Again, this is like streaming era stuff where like every song on an album goes, you know, is capable of charting if it's from a major artist. But, you know, I remember this being on like so many people's rotations, like in my circle of friends during like 2019, 2020. And you can tell that I think the pop music paradigm changed a little bit after that. You start seeing other artists experimenting with this type of sound. I mean, we just saw Taylor Swift do it in the Midnight's album with Vigilante shit. So it's an incredibly important record. So I'm glad to own it. I don't own Happier Than Ever, although I do like that album almost as much, if not just as much. I just haven't taken the time to own it yet, but I do like that one and the kind of cleaner sound that it goes for as well. But yeah, so ending with that, that's all I got for you today. So tune in next time. Next week, same time, same place. You know the drill. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell a friend as well. And until next time, I will see you right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive. Bye.